Morgon allihopa säger jag. Välkomna till denna andra dag av Uppdrag, Guds rike. Jag hoppas du är utvilad och ser fram emot det som ska ske idag. Vi har en verkligt spännande dag framför oss med föreläsning nu på morgonen, intressanta seminarier på eftermiddagen och kvällsmöte i kväll. Vi kommer att starta den här morgonen med ett föredrag på engelska och därför kommer jag att byta språk. Men det kändes bra att på ärans och hjältarnas språk få hälsa er alla väldigt välkomna till Uppdrag Guds rike den här lördag morgonen. So, welcome everybody to this second day of our conference. And this morning it's such an honor for me to introduce to you Professor Alister McGrath from Oxford University. Professor McGrath, originally from Belfast, Ireland, Northern Ireland, holds 3 doctorates from the University of Oxford, one in science, one in theology, and one in intellectual history. He's widely recognized as a public intellectual and a leading Christian apologist. So it's such a great honor for us to have Alastair with us this morning. Professor McGrath has written over 50 books, many dealing with issues of science and faith, and he has debating leading critics of Christianity like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and Stephen Law. He personally has a very interesting life story, moving from atheism to Christianity. And you can read about his story in his recently released memoirs, Through a Glass Darkly, Journeys Through Science, Faith and Doubt, a very captivating book that I really recommend. You can find a lot of material by Alister McGrath on YouTube. There is, for example, a 12-part new series called The Island of Faith, Journeying Through Atheism, Science and Faith. So it's really a great joy for us to have Alister McGrath as our speaker this morning. The topic is Faith and Reason in the Current Debate. How far have we come? That is a crucial issue for us who lives in a very secular culture, which often claims that reason has undermined or even disproved faith. During this lecture, you can send in your questions. At the bottom of your screen to the right, you can see a button saying Q&A. That's the one you should use. And you can write your question in English or in Swedish. We can translate it for you. Remember not to press enter until you have finished your whole text. And then after the lecture, Alastair will answer as many questions as possible within the time we have here. So this session ends at 12 o'clock. So we're really looking forward to this time together. And before I invite Professor Alister McGrath to speak, let's pray for our time together. Lord, we start our day by thanking you for giving us life, and even more for giving us grace and hope. Now we commit this day to you. We pray, let your kingdom come. Lead us into truth and continue to draw us to yourself. We pray that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. So, Professor Alister McGrath, warmly welcome.
Well, hello. It's very good to be with you today. And I'm very sorry I can't be with you in person. It's been a great joy to have been able to join you. But happily, I'm able to speak to you here from Oxford. And I very much wish that I was able to join you. And here I am in person, so to speak. And you can now see me as well, which is very nice. So let's begin by just telling you something about myself. My name is Alister McGrath, and as you're hearing, I used to be an atheist. And I want to talk to you about that because that I think is very important in thinking about this ongoing debate about faith and reason, because we do face a cultural pressure which says that you only believe what can be shown to be true. And so I'm going to explore that with you in our conversation this morning. When I was a teenager, I was actually quite an aggressive atheist. I was studying science at high school. I loved science, and I took the view that basically science was able to answer all of life's questions with certainty. And you will still find that belief widely shared amongst some scientists. And certainly it's quite a common theme in many parts of Western culture. I think one of the reasons that I was drawn to both science and to atheism was my feeling that these gave me certain answers to life's big questions. Religious people, I believed, simply had faith, which meant they asserted certain things but could not show that they were true. In other words, faith was about running away from evidence, running away from argument. And I think that as I was about 16, this really seemed very, very persuasive to me. Science and religion, I was told, were at war with each other. And of course, as I loved science, that meant I was at war with religion as well. But more importantly, I think I was averse to uncertainty. In other words, I found it very difficult to live in a world where you couldn't prove your beliefs certainly. And that's why science was so important to me. It seemed to me that science was able to say, here is the way things really are. You can trust this absolutely. And that's a very important point. And again, atheism just seemed to me to be self-evidently correct. It was very, very clear to me that science and atheism went together very, very well. Both of them were able to prove their beliefs, and really that was the end of the matter. However, as you will all know, it's not quite that straightforward. And certainly Richard Dawkins develops an approach to the understanding of faith and reason, which actually I would have agreed with when I was 16, but I'm afraid I don't agree with him anymore. So let me talk you through some of the issues that I think are very important here. I think the first point I'm going to make very, very clearly is that I used to think atheism was self-evidently correct, that religious people simply asserted their beliefs and that therefore atheism was intellectually superior. But here is the point that I now regularly make in debate with atheists. I would say that in effect, I concede I cannot prove that Christianity is true. With the same certainty, I can prove that 2 and 2 make 4. I would then say to them, well, I would like you to prove your atheism. And of course, it can't be done. And that's a very important point, because certainly one of the things I've learned in debating with new atheists like Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett or indeed Christopher Hitchens is that they apply criteria to judge religious belief, which they do not apply to their own beliefs. Now, let me talk you through that, because it is very, very important, and I want you to make these points in your dialogue with others. The key point is that Richard Dawkins says, look, religious people can prove their beliefs, so that means they are irrational. And of course, we don't need to prove atheism because it's so obviously right. And anyway, you can't prove a negative, so there you are. Atheism is just right. But my point is that atheism rests on a series of beliefs. And for example, you read Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, then it's one belief is that oppression is bad, another is that religion is bad. And these are moral beliefs, which of course you can't establish by either reason or by science. So in effect, Hitchens' critique of religion is based on beliefs he cannot prove. So the point I'm making is basically a very important point, and it's this. One of the facts that you and I and everyone else has to accept about the human situation is that we have to live by beliefs that we cannot prove to be true, but we trust in. We trust that they are right. And that is true of atheism as much as Christianity. Now, when I was young, when I was 16, I thought atheism is right. Religious people just invent their faith. But of course, I would now look back on my time as an atheist teenager, and I would say this. I would say, back then, I believed that there was no God, but I couldn't prove it. And therefore, it was a belief system. It was a faith. And so very often in debates with atheists, I will simply say, look, I think you and I are both people of faith because we believe something we can't prove to be right. They'll say, no, atheism is not a faith. It's simply, not believing in God. And I'll say, that's fine. But in effect, you are saying, well, we do not believe in God, therefore we believe that there is not a God. So you are, in effect, making a faith statement, even though you're trying very hard to disguise the fact. So that, I think, is a very important point. But here's another point, which I think is really important. One of the things I discovered about the natural sciences is that they are wonderful, but they are wonderful in certain areas only. And when I went to Oxford to study sciences back in the 1970s, I began to look at Albert Einstein in great detail. And Einstein, as I'm sure you know, thought science was wonderful, but also he was very, very clear science has its limits. For Einstein, science offers us a toolkit, a way of investigating reality. And it's a very reliable way of investigating reality, but it also has its limits. And for Einstein, if you like, science focuses on a certain group of questions which it believes it's able to answer reliably and authoritatively. This is the way in which things in this world relate to each other. But science is a toolkit which has been developed for certain purposes. And the point that Einstein makes, the point that many modern philosophers, like the British philosopher Mary Midgley, make, is that we need multiple intellectual toolkits because our world is complex. Unless you are going to reduce the world to what science can tell us is right, then in fact we need to use many toolkits. We need to look at the world through many windows if we are going to be able to do justice to its complexity. So what I'm saying to you is think of science as a toolkit. It works very, very well in some areas, but not in others. And as you will know, Richard Dawkins and others take the view that science is able to answer all our questions. So if you can't prove scientifically there's a God, then there isn't a God. Well, I think we're doing to challenge that. And it's a very important philosophical development, which is called the critique of scientism. Here in Britain, we have Ian Kidd, we have Mary Midgley, and of course, there are many in the United States who are very active in this debate as well. But I'm now going to ask you to do a thought experiment. I want you to look what I'm holding in my hand. I think you can see it's a thermometer. Okay, it's a thermometer. Now, thermometers are very useful tools because a thermometer will tell you your temperature. So it might be useful in this time of COVID for me to be able to work out whether I have COVID or not. A thermometer will help me work that out. Thermometers are good research tools. They tell you your temperature. Now, supposing I were then to argue like this. Listen to my argument. It is a very bad argument, but you will find this argument widely used in culture. Because this tool works so well at telling me my temperature, I can use it for everything. And therefore, I can in fact take this tool and I can use it to, for example, tell me what is right and what is wrong, or to tell me what the meaning of life is. So let's use the thermometer to tell me what the meaning of life is. So here we go. Right. It's not saying anything about the meaning of life. So there is no meaning to life. Now, you see the point I'm trying to make? That if you use a research tool that's developed for one purpose and apply it in a completely different area of thought, it doesn't answer your questions. And if someone like Richard Dawkins would say, well, therefore, because this does not show this, it's not there. I think the point I want to emphasize is that simply the improper and inappropriate use of a tool to draw false conclusions. That's a very important point. I think we also need to be very, very clear that science is actually about making judgments about what is right. Certainly, in our culture, people will say, well, science is able to prove its truths, and that is certainly true up to an extent. For example, the chemical formula of water is H2O. But the point I need to emphasize is actually science engages a rather limited area of reality. And I think that we need to go further on this and say this is not simply a problem with science, that really the whole area of proof, being able to show that something is absolutely reliable, is limited to mathematics and logic. And here's the point. Those are both closed systems. They don't impact on real life. And one of the things that I remember discovering when I was studying science in detail is, of course, that science changes its mind on things. that it thinks certain things at this point in time, but as it progresses, of course, it will change its mind and move on and think different things in the future. To give you a very obvious example, I mean, this is 2021. Supposing I was lecturing to you in 1921. The scientific consensus of that period was that the universe has always existed, that the whole idea of creation is simply, untenable. But nowadays, of course, there's been a radical change in scientific thinking. The universe had a beginning. And somehow Genesis 1 seems rather more credible today than it was back then. And that, I think, is a very important point, that very often people tend to give us this impression that science has proved conclusions definitively, and that is the end of the discussion. And of course, it's not. It's simply that science is saying, at the moment, this is what we think, but we cannot predict what we will be like in the future. And certainly, as a scientific positivist, as a younger man, I took the view that science proved everything for certain. No, I wouldn't say that. I would say that science, in effect, gives us very good reasons for certain things being true, but also for realizing that these are provisional truths, and some of them may be shown to be wrong in the future. And you might think of the chemist turned philosopher Michael Polanyi, who very famously pointed out that, in effect, scientists believe many things to be true, and they know that some of them will subsequently be shown to be wrong. But the difficulty is they don't know which ones those are. So that, I think, is a very important point to emphasize here, that science does change its mind on things. So I think someone like Richard Dawkins, who in effect says, look, you have to be able to prove your beliefs, he needs to learn, he has to apply that to his own beliefs as well. And a very important point here is that some new atheist writers, I think of, for example, the late Christopher Hitchens, would say, well, look, we don't believe anything. We simply accept what is factual. We don't believe, we simply know. But of course, the minute you start reading Christopher Hitchens, you realize his books are full of faith statements about moral values, about cultural norms and things like that. In effect, he has his own set of beliefs which he chooses not to draw attention to. So the point I'm trying to make to you is that Dawkins, I think, is right to say we need to give reasons for what we believe. I fully agree with that. But Dawkins is simply wrong to think that we can prove everything that we believe. So if I may, I'm going to give you a quote from the British philosopher Bertrand Russell. Russell was an atheist philosopher, and let me tell you about him. This is a quote from his book, A History of Western Philosophy. And he's asking, what is the point of philosophy? And here's what he says. Philosophy helps us to live without certainty, yet without being paralyzed by hesitation. I'll say it again. Philosophy helps us to live without certainty, yet without being paralyzed by hesitation. And a very important point here is that Russell simply knew that all the big questions in life lay beyond proof. And the point that Russell really is making is that atheism or Christianity, they both lie beyond verification rationally, logically, or of course, scientifically. And therefore, if you commit yourself to any of these positions, you do so going beyond the evidence. In short, you're taking a matter of faith. That's a very important point. You may not know this, but in 2012, Richard Dawkins debated Rowan Williams, who was then Archbishop of Canterbury in Oxford, and they covered a wide range of matters. And one of them was the rationality of religious belief. And Dawkins found himself in some difficulty because he was pressed very hard. Can you show that your atheism is right? Can you prove it? And in the end, of course, he had to say he could not. And unwisely, I think, but nevertheless truthfully, he said, actually, I think I'm agnostic. I believe something I can't prove to be true. And that really was the headline moment of that debate. But it's right. Dawkins was simply being honest. Atheism cannot be proved to be right. Now, those of you who are paying attention very closely will say, well, actually, haven't you just contradicted yourself? Because you talked about Bertrand Russell a moment ago as an atheist philosopher. But then you made the point that Russell was quite clear that you cannot prove atheism is right. And actually, this is right, because what Russell did was to say, I cannot prove atheism is right, but I choose to live my life as an atheist, as if it is true. Those of you who've read the Harvard psychologist William James will know this is a pragmatic approach. In other words, you say, I've got to make a decision. The evidence is ambiguous. I choose this way of doing it. But it's very important because Russell was always clear. He had adopted a position he could not prove to be true, but chose to base his life upon it. Now, I think that's a very important point for you to make in discussions and in argument. Bertrand Russell was very, very clear that although he might be an atheist in the popular sense of the word, he was not an atheist in the academic sense of the word, because, of course, he was epistemologically a pluralist. He could not, in effect, commit himself to being an atheist. I think is very important. So let's stand back from this. What I'm talking to you about is that any human belief, whether it is atheist, religious, whether it is political or moral, actually rests on evidence which is not sufficient to prove that it is true. And one of the intellectual historians and philosophers who dealt with this most effectively is the Oxford scholar Sir Isaiah Berlin. And he wrote a number of books on the need to learn to live with uncertainty. And he made the point that political ideologies, moral ideas, religious ideas, anti-religious ideas were things that nobody could prove to be right, scientifically, logically. And he drew two conclusions from this. One was we had to learn to live with this. He was very happy to talk about this being faith. And then he said, and secondly, because all of us are in the same position, we need to be generous towards each other. That actually, we're all making statements that go beyond the evidence. That does not mean, for example, that religious faith is irrational at all. No, it's simply saying that faith goes beyond the evidence, but that does not mean that faith is irrational. It simply means that faith goes beyond reason, reaching to where reason is unable to go. But back to Isaiah Berlin. He argued that human beliefs fall under three broad categories. First of all, those you prove scientifically. The chemical formula for water is H2O. Secondly, those that can be established by logical deduction. Well, I put 2 and 2 make 4 in that category. And those are both true. Chemical formula for water, H2O, 2 and 2 make 4. But let me make the point to you, they're not actually very exciting, and they don't give meaning to life. And then thirdly, Berlin says there's a third category of those which cannot be proved in either of those ways. And Berlin's point is that every moral, political, social, anti-religious, religious belief is in that third category. And this, I think, really puts this whole business of faith and reason in a very helpful context, because we now know so much about the cultural condition of reasoning. Read, for example, Charles Taylor's book, A Secular Age. We know that patterns of reasoning, that evidential criteria are very often established culturally, and we're aware that cultural forms of reasoning change over time. The key point is that once upon a time, during the Age of Enlightenment, which is the 18th century, you could say that faith is able to prove everything reliably. Now we wouldn't say that. We would say that, in effect, these are matters of judgment. We have to be able to give reasons for what we believe. In other words, we have to be able to justify beliefs, but we cannot prove them. That's true of atheism. It's true of Christianity. That does not solve the question of the rationality of faith, but listen very carefully. It contextualizes it. It shows that everybody else has exactly the same problem. So let me just mention one very obvious pastoral issue here, and it's this. A lot of Christians have doubts about their faith, and very often they feel isolated. We are the only group of people in the universe who have this particular difficulty. Well, you don't. Atheists also have doubts if they think about what they believe. And certainly I've had conversations with many leading atheists in Oxford who have told me, look, I often wonder if I'm right because I can't prove I'm right, and I'm aware there are other options and there are intelligent people who hold those options, and I might be wrong. So what I'm going to say to you is that an atheist who does not have doubts is simply trapped in a dogmatic worldview and unable to get out of it. So I think that's a very important point to make. But now let me move on. I asked you to do a thought experiment a few minutes ago. You'll remember I asked you to think about a thermometer. Well, let's think about something else now. Let us do a thought experiment. I'm going to ask you to accept only ideas that can be conclusively and decisively proved to be right. I've mentioned two. 2 and 2 make 4. Chemical formula of water is H2O. What sort of world would that be? In other words, try inhabiting that mental world. You'll find it is an uninteresting world. You cannot make moral decisions. You cannot make political decisions. You cannot make existential decisions because these lie beyond the proof by reason. And the point I'm trying to say is that there are some things you could believe, like 2 and 2 make 4. Well, that's wonderful, but it's not very exciting. It doesn't give me a reason to get up in the morning. It doesn't actually bring hope or joy. And here are some ideas you could not accept if you limit yourself to what reason alone can prove. Any moral, religious, or political ideas. Any view about the meaning of life, because whatever you say goes way beyond evidence. Any notion of what is good or bad. Believing there is a God, believing there is not a God. These all lie beyond that scope. And that's the point I'm trying to make, that actually Christians, in effect, are not the exception to a rule. They illustrate the rule very well, which is that meaningful human life depends on believing certain things that cannot be shown to be true, but are nevertheless enormously significant and can be justified. Here are some good reasons for thinking that is right, but not absolutely proved. I think that's a very important point to make. Now, I've talked a bit about changes in scientific thinking, and that actually is very important apologetically. Here in Britain in 1948, we had a very famous debate about God. It was on national radio. It attracted a huge audience. And it involved Bertrand Russell, who I mentioned, and Frederick Copleston, a very well-known Christian philosopher. And it was basically about the whole question of God. And it involved a number of issues, like, for example, can you develop a morality without God? Well, actually, Frederick Copleston won that from the Christian perspective. But one of the questions was, do you need God to explain the universe? And remember, this is 1948, a long time ago. Bertrand Russell won that part of the argument. He said, since the universe has always been here, it doesn't need to be explained by anything. We don't think that anymore. Science has moved on dramatically. And for those who say that scientific advance always entails religious retreat, that's what Richard Dawkins says, this is a very good counterexample to show that's nonsense. But here's my point. In 1948, we didn't know about the Big Bang. Nowadays we do. And in 1998, a very interesting thing happened. There was a replay of this debate to mark the 50th anniversary of it. And it was William Lane Craig, who I think you all know, on the Christian side, and the atheist Anthony Flew on the other side. Now, some of you who know about this will say, just a minute, Anthony Flew isn't an atheist anymore, is he? And that's right, he's not. And part of it was that debate really brought home to him there were some very serious problems with the atheist position arising from the Big Bang. So I want to make the point that's very, very important, that science is provisional. You can't predict where it is going. And Richard Dawkins himself says something very interesting, which you may know in his book, A Devil's Chaplain. He makes the point that in 100 years' time, we may not believe in Darwinism anymore, or if we do, it'll be in a radically changed form. And in one sense, he's right, because science is progressing. We cannot predict what the future will be, except that scientific theories keep on changing. And I find that very interesting, because, of course, Darwin bases his atheist worldview on his interpretation of Darwinism. Incidentally, Darwin did not see his own ideas as having any problems for religious belief at all, but that's for another lecture. But let me now talk about an issue which I think is really important. Many people link this idea of the debate between faith and reason with the debate between faith and science, because very often they'll say that science is the supreme cultural example of a rational activity. I want to say a few words about this, partly because I'm Professor of Science and Religion here at Oxford, and partly, of course, because I began my life as a scientist and began by thinking that science moved me away from any kind of religious faith, which I do not believe now. And one of the questions very often is raised, well, look, surely scientific explanations of the world make religious explanations or comments irrelevant. We don't need those. Science is able to give us perfectly good answers to or comments on our universe. Religion is just redundant. Well, no, I'm afraid that's not right. Let me again give you an example, which I hope you will find helpful. This example was developed by a British geologist called Frank Rhodes, who went on to become president of Cornell University in the United States. So let me give you the analogy and then tell me what Frank Rhodes has to say on this and why this is so useful. So I want you to imagine you are looking at a kettle that is boiling. Okay, I want you to imagine you are looking at a kettle that is boiling. Why is the kettle boiling? That's the question. Here's a scientific answer. Well, the kettle's boiling because electricity is being converted into heat. That's energy transfer. It raises the water's temperature to boiling point. So that's a very good answer. And I can assure you that that answer is correct. Okay, that's a very important point. But does the fact that that answer is right mean that that is the only answer? The answer is no. Here is the second reason why the kettle is boiling. The kettle is boiling because I wanted to make myself a cup of tea. You see, I'm British. And that is also true. And Frank Rhodes makes this point. These are different answers, but both are true, both are complementary and not competitive. There's a sense in which each is incomplete without the other. Now, he's right. So you see the point. Does the scientific explanation mean that the tea explanation is wrong? No, no. They are both part of a bigger picture. And that's why I want you to emphasize reality is complicated. You cannot, in effect, use one single research tool, one level of explanation, one single window onto reality to make sense of it. You need multiple ways of looking at it. And faith plays a very important role. So scientifically, you may talk about the cosmic origination we call the Big Bang, but religiously we talk about creation. You know, it's a different way of speaking, but they are valid perspectives on the way the universe came into being. So I think it's very important. But now I want to move territory slightly and talk about the whole question of the meaning of life, because this to me is a very important question. And what is interesting is that if you look at the history of classical philosophy, this was one of the reasons why philosophy came into being, to deal with life's big questions. What's it all about? How do we live the good life? But the American philosopher Susan Wolf, again, a very interesting writer, makes the point that nowadays very few academic philosophers engage this question. I think it's a very important point to make, because actually it is really important to ordinary people. I'm sure you will know there's a very large psychological literature, which in effect says that if you feel you have sorted out the question of the meaning of life, it's very good for your well-being. And that's an important point. It doesn't mean that this is right. It just means it has a very positive impact on life, which of course is something that a writer like Christopher Hitchens doesn't want to hear, because he wants to say that religion oppresses people. Well, no, it doesn't actually. It helps them to fulfill themselves. And the key point I want to emphasize here is that this is a major cultural issue. People want to know what life is all about, what they are all about. If I put it like this, we don't just want to know how things work. We want to know what they mean. And those are not the same things. Albert Einstein was very, very clear about this, that science was excellent at helping us to understand how our universe functions, how we function. But it can't deal with moral judgments. Here's what he says: science can only ascertain what is, not what should be. And outside its domain, value judgments of all kinds remain necessary. Einstein was absolutely clear that science can't establish moral values. It's very important, Einstein says, for scientists to be moral people. But he makes the point that science doesn't tell them what morality is all about. That has to come from somewhere else. And Richard Dawkins, I think, finds himself struggling on this point. Certainly some new atheist writers try to make the point science proves certain ethical beliefs, but actually the arguments they use are so weak that they are ridiculed by professional philosophers. So this is an important point, and it lies beyond reason, because you cannot prove that any meaning of life is right, but it's very important for us. Here is the British novelist Jeanette Winterson, and this is a sentence from her recent autobiographical memoir. I'm going to read it to you and see what you think about this. "We cannot simply eat, sleep, hunt, and reproduce. We are meaning-seeking creatures." Again, we cannot simply eat, hunt, sleep, and reproduce. We are meaning-seeking creatures. And that is actually very, very important, because she is saying that, well, reason can't answer these questions, but they really, really matter. We need answers, so we have to go beyond reason. And that is the problem that rationalism faces, that it in effect is able to identify a very limited area as being something you can prove. But human living needs more than that. It needs to go way beyond that. And you know, I can agree with anything can be proved rationally, of course, but actually that's a very small area of things, and real life is much bigger than that. And so in effect, rationalism is really irrelevant to real life. And Christianity is very, very good at helping us figure out how to live, and also how to identify questions of meaning and answer them. So that's a very important point. Let me engage a modern atheist American philosopher, Alex Rosenberg. I'm going to engage with a book he published in 2011 called The Atheist's Guide to Reality. Again, The Atheist's Guide to Reality. And Rosenberg says that as a philosopher, I say reality is restricted to what the sciences can tell us. Okay, reality is what sciences can tell us. And science, of course, is our only guide to reality. So we limit ourselves to what science, and in particular physics, is able to tell us. So he then gives a list of long-standing questions, and his answer, which is based on his philosophical approach to the natural sciences. Only science can answer questions, therefore you give only the answers that science can give. So question number one, is there a God? No. Question number two, what's the nature of reality? Answer, what physics says it is. What's the purpose of the universe? There is none. What's the meaning of life? There is none. Listen very carefully. What's the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There is no moral difference between them. Again, I'm going to read that question and answer, because you will be worried you may have misheard me. What is the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There is no moral difference between them. Now, I couldn't live with that, and I don't think most people could either. Rosenberg, in one sense, is just being absolutely consistent. He is limiting himself to what science is able to tell, and therefore he cannot say there is something different between right and wrong, good and bad. But if you can't do that, you can't engage the big questions of life. You can't engage politics. You can't engage morality. In other words, it's not livable. That's a very important point. And I think we need to make that point very, very clearly, that Christianity is not irrational. It simply goes beyond what unaided human reason is able to show, and it lets us break free from the imprisonment of rationalism. And that's the point at which I'm going to end. I'm going to talk to you about rationalism as imprisoning us. And this is not something I am making up. This is something that writers like Isaiah Berlin or Max Weber, to mention two very prominent intellectuals in the 20th century, thought was really important. That actually they argued that the history of human culture is a protest against the iron cage of rationalism. That's the phrase that Max Weber uses, within which we imprison ourselves by limiting ourselves to worlds which can be proved by reason. Those are very small worlds, they're very restrictive, and they imprison us. And so the point I'm going to make in closing is very simply this. Christ says to us in the Gospel of John, I have come that you may have life in all its fullness. It's liberating. It sets us free from that iron cage of rationalism. And that to me is really important. It's about liberating us from the immensely restrictive, impoverishing, inadequate view of rationalism. Rationalism cannot cope with beauty. It cannot deal with the life of the imagination. It cannot deal with morality. And of course, it cannot deal with the whole theme of hope in life, which is an integral part of what we as Christians would want to talk about. So let me wrap up this lecture to give you plenty of time for discussion. The key point I've been making is that if I was lecturing to an 1800, I would be dealing with a culture where, in effect, reason was supreme. Nowadays, the idea that reason is supreme only hangs on in cultural backwaters like the new atheism. Everyone else has worked out it is not good enough. It's not a reliable guide to reality, and we need something bigger and better than this. And I'm going to encourage you to think of those images I gave you. Think of, we need many windows, we need many toolkits to investigate a complex reality. If you simply use one toolkit to investigate reality, you reduce it to what that toolkit is able to tell you, and that is impoverishing and simply unworkable. So for me, Christianity is about trust in a God and trust in the way of thinking that this God makes possible, disclosed to us in Christ. And as a scientist, for example, one of the themes that I'm very drawn to is what I find in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 17, the idea that all things cohere or hang together or are brought together in Christ, which is a very important statement indeed. So as I end, here's the point I'm going to make. Do you remember the thermometer I waved at you earlier? The thermometer, because that's a tool. A tool is devised for certain purposes. It's limited, it's restricted. It works well in certain situations and not in others. And that's the problem with the rationalism of our culture. It works well in some situations. But for big questions like, who am I? Do I really matter? What is life all about? What is good? And is there a God? I'm sorry, rationalism is not going to answer those questions. And if it does, it is not giving proofs. It's simply asserting things dogmatically and hoping you won't notice the difference. Now, there's much more I could talk about, but I think it'd be much more helpful if we were to engage in discussion. And so I'm looking forward very much now to engaging with the questions that you'd like to ask. Thank you so much for listening, and it's been great to be with you in this very strange way, but very nice way, for this conference.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alastair, for this brilliant presentation. Very rich, very stimulating. And now we have plenty of time for questions, and you can continue to write your questions using the Q&A button. And I will hand over to Martin, who will help us with this section and with the Q&A. So Martin, you take over.
Thank you so much for a fascinating lecture, and thank you for being willing to take the time to respond to questions. And we have at the moment 10 or so questions. I will just encourage all of you participants again to click the Q&A button and submit your own questions. You can also vote for questions that have already been submitted. Just click the thumbs up button to show us which of the questions that are open that you feel are most crucial for Alastair to respond to. I am also within my rights to feed Alastair some of my own questions or choose between the questions in the list. And I will actually, before I go to the list, I would like to ask you, Alastair, you had a very clear and enlightening illustration of the toolkit and the thermometer, which is very useful for some types of questions or examinations and less so for others. What would you encourage us to think of as tools or appropriate tools when it comes to the God question? what's the toolkit or specific tools that you would encourage us?
Thank you. I think here is what I want to say. I think this is a very good question. So I'm going to talk about this for a few moments because it is such a good question. I think that very often we think in terms of proving God from what we see in the world around us, or perhaps arguing that the Big Bang is something that we can interpret better from a theistic perspective than from a secular perspective. I want to say those are very, very good. But if you're a scientist, you'll know that one way of testing out a hypothesis is, so to speak, to see how well it works. And one of the reasons why I like C.S. Lewis so much as a writer is that C.S. Lewis says that it's not so much individual proofs of God's existence, it's much more thinking about the Christian big picture. In other words, think about the rich tapestry of faith we get when we weave together all the biblical insight. And what you do is you say, let me bring that way of looking as a whole to bear on reality. For example, to what I observe in the world around me, or indeed what I experience within me. And Lewis's argument is that it makes far more sense than a secular view does. And Lewis, I think, is very helpful here because he is, in effect, inviting us to appreciate how intellectually rich and capacious the Christian way of thinking is. So I just found this quote from C.S. Lewis. I think it's very good. I'm going to read it to you. I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And Lewis is kind of giving us an analogy here, that you think of a sun rising on a landscape, the shadows begin to go away, you see things more clearly, things come into focus. He's saying, think of not just proving this bit of Christianity or that bit of Christianity, but rather ask people to step inside a Christian way of thinking and see how well the world looks from that perspective. Scientifically, that's very often how you judge a theory, how well the theory renders reality. That's a very powerful apologetic approach.
Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, first question from the audience then. Mats asks, a very common argument these days, an argument against Christianity, you might say, is that the theist or the Christian believer has the whole burden of proof. Do you have any comments on that?
I think anyone who asserts anything has to take the burden of proof. And very often, as I was saying, we are made to feel that we are exceptional and therefore we have to prove things everybody else doesn't need to. In other words, if you like, there's a rational asymmetry, by which I mean no one else needs to prove anything, but we have to prove our beliefs. So what you need to do is say very clearly, well, I'm very happy to tell you why I think there is a God. I want you to tell me why you think you are right. You know, we'll do a deal here. I want to make the point that none of us is able to prove our views about the existence of God. I'm going to tell you what I think and why I think I'm right. I want then you to tell me what you think and why you think you're right. And it is very, very unsettling for the other person because very often they have not thought about these things. And so I very much want to encourage you to respectfully encourage people who are critiquing you to apply the same critique to themselves. If they say, well, look, if you prove there's God scientifically, I'll accept that. They'll say, okay, well, let's talk about that. Can you prove your beliefs scientifically? They'll say, oh, we have none. I'll say, I'm sorry, you do. You have lots of them. That's the whole point. We all have a network of implicit beliefs that we have not identified and interrogated. And so we really need to help people see that Christians are just being honest about their commitment to things, whereas others have these commitments that they refuse to value or to evaluate or even identify. So I think there's a very important conversation we need to have there.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm just going to go ahead and there we are. So that response brings up the issue of doubt, in my opinion, that you also discussed in your lecture, and you spoke of doubt as a pastoral issue, which is how we frame it as Christians. But it's interesting to me to think of doubt as a pastoral issue even with non-believers, and I think many Christians have the experience of as we look backwards, realizing that certain doubts were helpful. They actually helped us grow and move in the direction of the truth by questioning some of our beliefs. So what is a good, both, I guess, rationally responsible, but also pastorally responsible way of maybe encouraging doubts in order to help people move towards the truth? How do you do that sensitively?
I think this is a very good question. Certainly, I came to faith at Oxford University in 1971, and certainly I began by experiencing a lot of doubts. There were questions I had which actually I couldn't answer, and actually some of my friends couldn't either. And so in one sense I had doubts, but what I said to myself is, well, look, there are answers to these questions I just don't know at the moment, and therefore part of my journey of faith is going to be to find those answers. In other words, you say, this is not something that's going to overwhelm me. I'm going to find those answers because they will help me, and then they will also help the people I'm talking to. And in one sense, actually, that's why I'm apologist, because apologists deal with these questions to try and show, to try and help Christians, give answers, but also a point which I emphasize throughout this lecture is to contextualize them, which is they are not the only people who have these doubts. Atheists, if they think about these things, will be in exactly the same position. But it is helpful, I think, to work through some doubts and show how answers can be given, because very often doubt it takes two different forms. One is a kind of cognitive doubt. I'm not sure I can believe that. And certainly when I was younger, I thought the doctrine of the Trinity was absolute irrational nonsense, and I do not think that anymore. I grew up and grew into the doctrine. But there's also, if you like, a relational aspect of doubt, which is I'm not sure I can trust God. You see, again, that's different. And again, of course, there's a very powerful Christian answer to that, and I've actually discovered that answer, and that helped me to grow as a Christian. So what I'd want to say is that in our journey of faith, I think all of us will wrestle with questions, and we become stronger by doing so, and we'll be able to help other people who are also struggling with those questions as well. So I think it's very important to be able to talk these things through with people and help them to see that doubt is like a spiritual growing pain. In effect, it helps you to ask questions, to look for answers, and to expand your vision of faith. I mean, Christ tells us to love God with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our mind. And so for me, if you like, there's a discipleship of the head, the mind, not just discipleship of the heart and of the hands. We need to, in effect, say part of our role as Christians is to think and help other people who are thinkers.
Thank you. Okay, switching gears here a little bit. A question on some of these leading atheist figures that you have referenced. Bertrand Russell, Hitchens, Dawkins, and so forth had some strong, or have some strong moral beliefs. They don't seem to hold these beliefs with uncertainty, but rather with a lot of certainty. Have you seen any serious attempt to justify such certainty in light of such strong naturalism?
No, I haven't. One of the things I like about Aristotle is he says, I paraphrase him, is that nothing convicts like conviction. What he means is if you say something with absolute certainty, people say, oh, okay, that's right. And so Hitchens will say with complete confidence something that's absolute rubbish, and the confidence with which he asserts it, in effect, the audience says, oh, well, it must be right. He's saying it so confidently. And certainly, I mean, one of the things you might want to say is, well, look, it's a very interesting idea. Do I have to stop you there and ask how you could prove that to be true? Because you're depending on that so much. And if you're wrong, of course, then the whole thing falls to pieces. What are the reasons for thinking that is right? And he would say, oh, give me 5 minutes, I can prove that. But he doesn't. He won't. And I think there's a real issue there to be aware that very often when somebody uses very aggressive rhetoric, they use aggressive rhetoric because there's a rationally weak case lying behind it. And the more rhetorical you become, the weaker your case actually is. So I think we do need to challenge that. And I don't mean to be rude to people, but certainly to say, I'm so glad to hear that view stated so confidently. I personally couldn't accept it at all. Here are my problems with it. Can you show me I'm wrong? And you need to really shift the burden of proof, and help the audience, if there's an audience listening to you, realize that what this guy is saying so confidently is actually either a cultural construction or a sort of passing social idea, but not actually something that can be defended with the complete conviction he clearly thinks it is.
Very good, thank you. Okay, another question from the audience here. People are doing a lot of searching today, but mostly looking inwardly through techniques like yoga or mindfulness, etc. Would you say that this tendency is a sign of, does it essentially not prove, but does it speak in favor of atheism, or is it a sign of universal and I guess enduring spiritual needs that people have?
This is a very good question. So I'm going to give quite a long answer because it is such a good question.
Oh, please do. Yes, go ahead.
I think that it's a problem for atheism because people are looking within them because they are not trusting what they see outside them. You know, they feel that that science, that public institutions, and so on are not giving them answers that they find satisfying. So they're looking inside them because they've lost trust in other things. I think it's a very important point to make because the atheist writer Sam Harris, who's one of the leading new atheist writers, is very interested in Eastern mysticism. And he's asked why. He says, well, of course, atheism doesn't deal with, inner questions. So I go there for my answers. But his atheist friends are very angry because they say, you are telling people that atheism is inadequate. And of course it is. It doesn't deal with that. So I think looking inside you is actually a very important indication that people are not getting good answers from the culture around us, from public intellectuals. So I go back to the 16th century. I go back to John Calvin. And John Calvin said, look, there are two ways of naturally recognizing there might be a God. One of them is looking at the world around us and the night sky, the beauty of the human body, and that is an indicator of the existence of God. But the other thing is you look inwards, and Calvin uses the Latin phrase sensus divinitatis, the sense of godness within you. And actually, this opens up new opportunities for us as apologists. What we need to do is to, in effect, talk about Christianity as, in effect, being able to fulfill our heart's desires. And it's a very deep theme in Christianity. You think, for example, of Jonathan Edwards, the great American Puritan writer. His ideas are developed by John Piper more recently, or you might go back to Calvin, or you might go back to Augustine of Hippo or Pascal. They all talk about this. The heart has its reasons, which reason doesn't really know about. So in effect, you're able to say, look, I think you're questing for something really significant. You haven't found it in the world. You're looking within you. Can I talk to you about how Christianity speaks about fulfilling the heart's desire? And it's very important to us because Christianity is very, very rich. It's rationally rich, it's emotionally rich, it's imaginatively rich, and has a lot to say for those who feel they are looking for something and haven't found it. And we can begin to help them to see how this is all about, if you like, the prodigal son in Luke 15 coming home and being reconnected with what life is all about. So I would strongly say that this is a problem for atheism. It's not a problem for us because there is a long established apologetic tradition of engaging these deep questions people have and their exploration of their inner lives. And we can both show them that their instincts are pointing towards God, and that when you meet God, you begin to reconnect with a broader horizon, with what's outside you as well, because you realize there's a bigger picture which both deals with what's inside you, but also what lies beyond you. So I think there's some very interesting apologetic possibilities here.
Yes, thank you. I agree, and it's a very interesting answer you gave there. Now, would you say, it seems to me when I hear that response from you, that when we look outside ourselves, when we look at the universe and creation, the way it directs us towards God is in a positive way in terms of its beauty, its order, apparent design, so forth. Whereas when we look within ourselves, it's almost the opposite. It's out of our lack or felt need for God that the inward look pulls us toward God. Am I hearing you right there?
I think I'm saying that it doesn't matter whether we are beginning by looking at the world around us or looking within us. I mean, Christianity is able to interpret what we're experiencing. If I could just go back to interpreting the world beyond us, John Polkinghorne, who's a very good friend of mine, died 2 days ago. And I'm very, very sad about that. But he made a point very, very clearly, which is that science helps us to appreciate the ordering of the world, the fact that we're able to make sense of it, but it doesn't tell us why that order is there or why we are able to make sense of it. We need a bigger picture to be able to do that. Einstein makes a very similar point, and that's, for me, Polkinghorne was simply making the point, Christianity gives you this framework which allows you to understand why science works so well in the first place, but also what science's limits are, the questions it can't answer. But going back to the internal world, I mean, the internal world, our internal worlds are muddled and confused. And we need to make it very, very clear that we do like to think of ourselves as being rational, but actually modern psychologists, think of the work of Jonathan Haidt in North America, is in effect saying that very often our rational instincts are governed by our emotions and we don't realize it. So that's why reason is so unreliable. We need someone from outside to tell us what's wrong with us and what can be done. And that's a very important point, because if you like, the Christianity is not simply saying there is something wrong with you. It's saying, and something can be done about it. It's a diagnosis and a cure. And we need to make sure that we present the gospel as saying that we've worked out what the problem is. Now, here is how we can do something about it. I think that's a very important point to make.
Yes, thank you. Another question from the audience then, and it starts out with almost the opposite observation from the previous one. We spoke about how many people are searching in various ways and looking inwardly and so forth. Now, one of our participants also observes that a lot of people, or perhaps even most people in Swedish society, only puts or raises the kinds of questions which can be replied to or responded to by the thermometer. So how do you engage with the lack of interest in religious questions? In other words, we see both trends at the same time, don't we? We see some people doing a lot of searching, whereas we also see a lot of indifference in our time. How do we engage with people who seem to be mostly indifferent to these bigger questions?
Yes, I think this is a very good question, and I can understand exactly the kind of person you're talking about. What I would say is this: there are many people who give the outward appearance of complete happiness or security or indifference, who say, I don't need religion. And then something happens. They become ill. They lose their jobs. Their source of security is taken away from them. And they suddenly realize we need something, we haven't got it. And very often it's when people pass through a crisis that they begin to realize there are some very big questions they have simply ignored and have to rethink everything. And, you know, I know many people who come to faith from exactly the position you've described because something happened that forced them to rethink things. Now, obviously, I'm not saying we make life difficult for people so this will happen, but I am saying that we are aware of this. There may come an opportune moment, a kairos, if you like, when this will happen. But more generally, I think that what this brings out the importance of what I call narrative apologetics, which is telling your own story. And certainly, I have many friends who are leading theologians or pastors here in Britain, and their story is, I used to think this was useless, of no interest whatsoever. And then something happened, and I'm going to tell the story of what happened to me. And of course, the implication is this might happen to you as well. So we need to make sure people tell their stories so people can say, actually, this is happening to me. I think I remember somebody telling me about this. I need to think about this. We need people to tell their stories so that other people in your culture can see there are possibilities here. And if they find themselves in this position, they will know what to do about it.
Thank you. Had I been in my home office, I would have held up your book, Narrative Apologetics, for the participants to see. Unfortunately, I left it at home. But I think that's an excellent response, so thank you. Now, if I may come back to that question with a question of my own, and you mentioned moments or stages of life when you face a crisis and how that can be what enters someone into this more open frame of mind where they will ask questions. a common critique of religion in our day is that it is a crutch for weak people. So it's essentially a critique that, well, it's only because of these crises that people will even entertain religious answers or views. You quoted Bertrand Russell, who said that philosophy is a help to not be paralyzed with hesitation. And I would like to hear you reflect on whether atheism and that quest for certainty can function as a crutch in the same way, or perhaps in an analogous way to the way religion can.
Yeah. Okay, that's a very good question. Here's the point I'm going to make, and it's a very important point. Freud talks about wish fulfillment. What he means by that is that we wish things were like this, so we invent a world in which things are like that. That is critique of religion. The problem is it also applies to Freud. He's invented a world that he would like to be like that, an atheist world. And there is now a very, very large body of literature which shows that actually many people become atheists because that they do not want there to be a God. In other words, the desire comes first, then the rationalization. To give an example, I mean, one of the philosophers I engage with quite a lot in my recent works is Thomas Nagel, Nagel. Very, very good. I really enjoyed his view from nowhere. I think is very, very good. But in one of his books, Nagel, in effect, says, look, I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the world to be like that. And then I provide the reasons for the world not being like that afterwards. The desire comes first. His is a crutch. He does not want there to be a God because it would be inconvenient for him. And therefore he invents a world and justifies it rationally with that point of view. And so I would want to say that certainly in my own history, I was an atheist because I wanted certainty. You see what I'm saying? There was something that I wanted, which was more significant than atheism, which is certainty. And I thought atheism provided that, then began to realize it did not. So what I would say to you is that actually the view that somehow it's only religious people who are inventing universes to meet their desires is not true. Most people invent universes to meet their desires. Even the kind of person we were talking about a moment ago who doesn't want to engage with religious questions, sometimes there's a desire to keep out of conflict, to keep away from controversy. So say, I'm not going to talk about this because it will get me into difficulty. And so it's that desire which in effect fosters religious disengagement. So we need to be aware of that. Thomas Nagel is a very good example to give if you're in conversation or if you're giving a talk on this theme.
Yes, quite. Thank you. I see we managed to preempt a question from one of our colleagues here who brought up Thomas Nagel, and apparently he calls this in particular a cosmic authority problem, and he does have a way of infuriating his atheist friends with his brute honesty there. Let's go to a question from the audience here. Science certainly has its limits. So does all our knowledge and understanding, but it can increase. For a long time, science told us that we had a lot of junk DNA in our chromosomes. It was leftovers, so people thought, from our evolutionary past. Nowadays, it has become very clear that DNA is much more sophisticated than we knew before, and almost all DNA is now found to be very useful. What does this tell us about science, our knowledge, and evolution? I'm not sure there whether he speaks of biological or epistemological evolution.
It's a good question. I think that one of the dangers is that we think that science is complete. We've answered this question. And actually, very often it's simply a temporary resting place. We think we've understood it, but of course, then things move on. We begin to realize you have to revisit questions. I mentioned the question of the origins of the universe, but that's simply a big example. There are lots of others you can give. It's a general process. And most scientists would now say, look, we can't really answer these questions because our answers will be out of date in 15 years. Certainly, a friend of mine who teaches biology at Cambridge says that he recommends his students to not read any publications which are more than 5 years old because the field is moving so quickly. And you can see how unsettling that is, that actually what might seem to be scientific certainties of one period actually simply become, that was what they thought back in 2010, because things move very quickly. So I think that's a very important point. I enjoy reading Arthur Koestler's book, dealing with scientific progress, makes the point that actually the whole trajectory of science is littered with bleached skeletons of theories that were once thought to be absolutely certain, then proved to be, obsolete. So I think that is very important. I think what I would say is that you can certainly say that at the moment science thinks this, but it may think otherwise in 10 years' time. So I'm very, very skeptical of those who think we have closure on certain questions. I think we keep them all open.
Do you think it's helpful to speak of science as that big, using that big monolithic term, science as this?
No, it's not. You're right. There's a big literature criticizing what's called singular science, the scientific method. Because, if you think of physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, they're all sciences, but they use different research methods. So what you could say is that there is a common core to natural sciences, which is you try and assess evidence, you try and be impartial, you try and weave as much of the evidence together as you can. But actually, each discipline uses its own approach. So it's thought that the use of the singular science is was actually probably the result of a conference in 1831 in England, where people began to talk about science rather than the sciences, mainly because they wanted to achieve a sense of solidarity across scientific disciplines. People were worried that science was kind of a way, it was fragmented. So one way of holding it together is to say there is science, and each of you individually represents part of that. But most scientists would recognize their own distinct disciplines are different. They use their own distinct working methods, and they see themselves as part of a broader project. But very often they don't know about the broader project because they're so specialized in their own discipline.
Yeah. Thank you. Great. Question from the audience here. Sweden is often said to be one of the most secular countries of the world, not one of the most atheist. How would you regard the relationship between atheism and secularism? Can secularism be considered a worldview?
That's a very rich question, and it would take me a long time to give a good answer. And I mentioned Charles Taylor's book, A Secular Age, a few moments ago, and actually if he is right, then secularism is not what we think it is. What I would say is that that secularism can be understood in many ways. Sociologically, it's about, in effect, religious institutions having less authority in today's culture than they did in the past, and so on. And of course, you can argue that it's also about the diminished impact of religious knowledge in our culture. One of the things I very often find is that people are now so biblically illiterate in Britain that I can tell the parable of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15, and people don't know how it ends. So, so you get the sense of surprise, which I'm sure was part of the original context of that parable. So I think what I would say is that I don't think atheism and secularism are the same. I think that that the evidence suggests that actually people may not believe in God, but very often have deep intuitions about the meaning of life or things like that, which make them think there might be more than I know, but I'm not quite sure where to take this. So it's if you like, it's not so much atheism, it is uncertainty about these things. You kind of disengage. And of course, if you define atheism as not actively believing in God, then of course atheism takes in agnosticism. And of course, most agnostics would be very, very angry about that. But, agnostics don't believe in anything, so they don't believe in God, yes, but that doesn't mean they're atheists for that reason.
Yeah, there are many different terms to use here. And I think it's usually very helpful in a conversation with someone if they whether they define themselves as atheist or agnostic or secularist, to actually ask them what they mean by that.
Exactly. They're not helpful terms.
Yeah. Okay. Even though faith and science are mostly complementary, are there any areas or issues where you see a real tension, contradiction, or conflict?
Well, I mentioned one earlier. throughout the history of Christian thought, there's been a tension between Christians who believe in creation and natural philosophers and scientists who until very recently believed in the eternity of the universe. For example, Aristotle asserted the eternity of the universe for very poor reasons, I have to say, but became a kind of dogma for natural philosophy in the Middle Ages. And certainly I would say that that was a major problem for many Christian theologians over a period of 1,000 years. And what they did was say, well, look, what we are saying is there is natural reason and there's divine reason. And they seem to take us in different directions at this point. We will trust revelation. And they were right to do so. I think there will be points, but as we discussed in relation to an earlier question, very often a problem that arises might be a temporary problem. It's a temporary problem because it reflects a present scientific interpretation of things, which turns out to be a transient scientific interpretation of things. So I think what I would say is that if you have if you, for example, understand the biblical narrative to say that the act of creation took place 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, which I have to say is not something the Bible says. It's an interpretation of what the Bible says. Then I think you'd find that you are in conflict with science. I think, however, I would want to say that actually that is not what the Bible says. It's an interpretation of it, and maybe we need to review that interpretation. So that the issue there is not biblical authority, it's biblical interpretation. So I think that's an important point to make. What I would say is that I have seen theologians who respond to new scientific discoveries, and then 20 years later, science has kind of moved on in a different direction, and the theological responses seem rather strange, frankly. So I'm cautious about this. Science is provisional, it's on a journey, it hasn't arrived at its destination, and therefore it's going to keep changing its mind. I think that's a very important point to emphasize.
Thank you. Okay, we are approaching, we have about 10 more minutes, so we have time for a few more questions here. What do you think about the influence of humanism in the church? Humanism looks so nice or benevolent, I guess. How can we handle this issue as Christians?
Well, I think we need to talk about what humanism is.
Yes.
Because certainly in modern English, the word humanism has come to mean something like a purely secular or atheistic worldview. But when people began to use those terms back in the 13th and 14th centuries, that wasn't what they meant at all. What they meant is a way of looking at the world that took the classical tradition very seriously and was concerned about human fulfillment. And in a sense, humanism is a neutral term. It's in effect about how we achieve human betterment and fulfillment. But that can't be done without an intellectual understanding of what humanity needs to achieve that fulfillment. And so secular humanism says, well, of course, we're fulfilled if we get rid of religion. Well, that's one way of looking at it. But someone like Erasmus of Rotterdam or Thomas More, any of these great 16th century humans say, no. What happens is that Christianity brings us to fulfillment. It gives us what we need. It allows us to achieve our original God-given role. And so there is no difficulty in talking about Christian humanism, which means achieving human fulfillment on the basis of a Christian understanding of what this is and how it is achieved. And I certainly often irritate my secular humanist friends by saying they have hijacked the word humanism, and that actually is open to a Christian interpretation, which I will then give. And they get annoyed. I have to say, I say to them, look, Christianity is not diminishing humanity. We are offering an accurate account of what the human problem is in order to change things, in order to actually make things better. So I think that's a very important point. People very often think that to say we're sinful is disparaging. No, it's just telling the truth and saying this is the way it is, but we can do something about it. It's like a doctor saying, you have an illness, but here is how we can deal with that. So I think we do need to challenge people about what humanism is. But in general terms, you're right. Humanism is becoming more influential because people think it fosters harmony. It fosters tolerance. But it doesn't actually. It is advancing its own agenda, really.
Thank you. Okay, next question here. To me, there is a great paradox here, with many atheists being strongly influenced by the thinking of the modern paradigm, whereas most people today and the humanistic sciences are more into the postmodern paradigm. What effects do you see this have on the issues we have discussed today? What would you say are the main differences between modern and postmodern atheism?
Well, I think modern atheism really is people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. And what I would point out is that these are both old male people, white. You know, they are modern in the sense of being locked into a particular way of thinking, which is actually now fading. The new atheism is in effect simply a form of modernism. It is about a form of foundationalism. It has an excessive trust in reason, and that's one of the reasons why that version of atheism actually has lost its way, because most younger people will say, "Well, look, that's so dogmatic. That is simply unwilling to accept multiple perspectives." I think one of the things I have found helpful is to say, well, look, we are now in a postmodern period, although I don't think we'll keep calling it postmodern because that term isn't all helpful anymore. But people are open to multiplicities of perspectives. And what I will say is, look, Christianity is very good at recognizing multiple perspectives, but it's still saying we have something distinct to say. And actually, one of the things we are doing is giving a way of looking at things that brings coherence, because the difficulty of any multi-perspectival framework is it's incoherent, you know. And so this is the opportune moment for us to go back to that theme I mentioned in the New Testament, Colossians 1:17, which is about the coherence of things. Christianity gives you this way of seeing the world which restores its coherence. That, I think, is a very important argument for us to use about Christianity in this changing cultural situation.
Yes, I agree. And it's a very interesting issue, isn't it, when it comes to, because we have been discussing reason mostly and used it in the singular, and more people are doubting whether there is a universal standard or standard universal criteria of rationality. Is there, so in a sense, you're saying that from a Christian perspective, we can show people how or why there are universal criteria or universal standards of reason?
We can, and that's the argument you find in C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity or The Abolition of Man. And I think one of the points that we need to talk more about, and you've made a very good point here, is that we talked about singular science a moment ago. We also talked about singular reason. Actually, history makes it absolutely clear we reason in different ways at different times. Sure, there's a single human faculty of reasoning, but the way in which we reason changes from one culture to another. And that's one of the reasons why the new atheism is trapped in the 18th century. Do you know the final chapter of Christopher Hitchens' book, God Is Not Great? It's all about, why don't we go back to the 18th century? Well, you know, in his dreams, you know, I mean, basically that they hadn't thought about the limits of reason back then. Now we know. And the reason I'm so critical of reason is I've used my reason. That, you know, it's like Pascal. The ultimate goal of reason is to critique itself.
Well, wonderful. Thank you. And I don't know if we have time for one last question. I think Stefan would like to come in as well to wrap things up. Are you standing by, Stefan, or would you like me to give Alastair one last question?
You can take one more question. One more question.
All right. Let's see here. So we have one question that was posed early here about fine-tuning, and the question is phrased as, who is doing the fine-tuning of the universe? Now, I think I can be confident that we would give roughly similar questions as to who is doing it, but what do you think of fine-tuning as a pointer towards God?
Fine-tuning is a clue, and clues on their own don't prove anything. Fine-tuning is a phenomenon. The difficulty is knowing how to interpret it. And so you have three options. One, it's nice for us, but we don't know why. Two, it might be different in another universe. But the third view is the Christian. Well, what do you expect? on the basis of the Christian understanding of creation. This fits into a Christian way of thinking. So the point I would make is that fine-tuning on its own proves nothing, but it fits in nicely to a Christian way of thinking, which is why Richard Dawkins wants to believe in a multiverse, because he thinks it makes it more difficult to argue for God there.
Wonderful. That was a very quick response. Thank you. And thank you for taking all this time to respond to questions from myself and from the audience. It was really fun to get to
thank you for
these
some very good
issues.
questions. I've enjoyed the questions, and I think sometimes the questions were rather better than the answers I gave.
Yeah, I also want to say a warm thank you for a most interesting and stimulating morning. Thank you so much, Alastair. Unfortunately, we cannot extend to you a warm applause we would have if this would be a normal conference, but I would really like to extend a warm thank you to you for taking the time and sharing this with us and helping us and challenging us in many areas. So a warm thank you from us. I've heard rumors that you are, God willing, coming to Sweden, maybe already the upcoming autumn. So we are looking forward to maybe welcoming you in real life here in Sweden. So warmly welcome back to Sweden, and thank you so much for this morning. And with those words, I will switch over to Swedish for some short information. Som ni vet så är ju konferensen Uppdrag, Guds, rike arrangeras av ett antal organisationer, och en av organisationerna är vi i Apologia, Centrum för kristen apologetik, och det är vi som har haft ansvar för den här förmiddagen. Jag borde förstås ha introducerat Martin Helgesson, som är en av medarbetarna i teamet på Apologia. Och det här som vi har pratat om den här förmiddagen, det är ju mycket av det som är fokus i Apologias arbete, och är du intresserad av mer sånt här material så ger vi ju kontinuerligt ut böcker med apologetiskt innehåll och producerar filmer och reser ju när det inte är pandemi för att hjälpa församlingar att börja jobba med den här sortens frågor. Så kolla gärna in vårt arbete på apologia.se.